Hi, my name is Cecile Johnson, and this is Bill Patterson, my co-host, and we are here as part of Global City Unity's community outreach. We're here to keep you informed about issues affecting the global Black community, and these issues require us to unify and be on one accord and find solutions. So I'll give you a little background about myself. I am the CEO and founder of African Development Plan, which is a nonprofit here in Chicago. And a lot of the work that I do is research on the Black community and focusing on educating the people, looking at root causes, and I do a series of presentations that we call Connecting the Dots. I'm also a board member of the National Black Agenda Consortium and co-founder of the JPPC, LLC, a Planning and Sustainable Development Consortium, and I'm also a human rights defender. I say all of this, it's a lot, because when you see the things that we're going to begin to talk about and the approach that we're going to take, you'll see how the different experiences that I have tie in. My co-host, William Patterson, is the co-founder of JPPC, LLC, which is a Planning and Sustainable Development Consortium, and they're launching a series of training and support initiatives to transform American communities, right? Based on the things that we're going to be talking about, the issues, we have designed what we call a framework that we'll be using to implement. So this series is going to address issues of leadership development, a series of transformation strategies, and it's going to focus on rapid transformation and turnkey implementation solutions. Bill has spent over 3 decades with over 40 Fortune 500 and major public sector institutions, and he's developed many strategies. So what we're looking at is taking all of that private knowledge, best training, best practices, and bringing it back to the community where we can utilize those skills. So welcome, Bill. Thank you for sharing this time with me.
Thank you for inviting me, Cecile. It's my pleasure.
Okay. So over the next few weeks, we're going to be doing a few things. We're going to host a series of talks, and we'll start off with what are some of the challenges facing the Black community, and what are some of the challenges in terms of community and stakeholder engagement, right? So people, you're going to have to get involved, okay? How have these challenges kept us from achieving our maximum potential, and what are some of the new opportunities? So, lucky for us, this year in January, a really important study came out. It's called the Racial Wealth and Resource Divide, and it was labeled the issue of access. Here's what it said. So, the Racial Wealth Divide came out, and it was written by Dedrick Asante Muhammad. The story in Chicago, it says, is one of access, or rather a lack thereof. Often recognized as one of the most segregated cities in the United States, today Chicago is the product of decades of policies that have had the effect of isolating communities of color. This is very important. During the early 20th century, government officials implemented policies that worked against said communities. City leaders used their legislative redistricting power to redraw school district lines, and the city's housing market kept African American families separate in what came to be known as the Black Belt on the city's south side. Through the use of such tools as exclusionary zoning laws, racially restrictive covenants, and racial steering, Chicago's political establishment of the time laid the foundation for today's rigid racial boundaries. These stark racial boundaries transcend real estate and have had far-reaching implications on whole communities' access to health care, to financial services, and especially education. As you'll see in some of the series that I've done before, where we talk about how Black and Latino children are doing versus how white children are doing here in Chicago public schools. In Chicago, these boundaries have led to educational outcomes that are far worse than the nation, and that's very true. While the story of unequal access to service is not dissimilar from those of other cities, the rigidity of Chicago's racial boundaries is what sets the cities apart. Without intentional effort to ensure equitable access to such services as education, housing, healthcare, and banking, the city is at a risk of continuing along the path of racial inequity and segregation. And this is hot off the press, January 2017, right? Now, this is interesting that the issue in Chicago is one of lack of access, because it clearly states that the government had a role in creating this crisis that you see happening to us. So guess what? This is May 2017. Hot off the press again is a book that was put out called The Color of Law, published by Richard Rothstein, right? Just came out this month. And what he has done, he has documented how what you see happening, the segregation in the cities and the major problems that we've been having in the social strife, are explicit government policies at the local, state, and federal level. So in the past, we have come on and we've talked about what we call de facto segregation, where we look at the private practices, right? To scholars, they say, and social critics, racism in our neighborhood has long been viewed as a manifestation of unscrupulous real estate agents, and yes, there has been, unethical mortgage lenders, and yes, there has been, and exclusionary covenants, right, which said that black people couldn't live a certain place. However, what he has documented in this book called The Color of Law is that in case after case, it's really de jure, what they call de jure segregation or government-sponsored segregation, because the government laid down some policies that actually created this condition that then had those unscrupulous real estate agents and unethical mortgage brokers come into play. So the two most important policies in the mid-20th century that segregated metropolitan areas was one. The first was that the public housing program, which was frequently demolished integrated communities, right? And then set up segregated public housing. So they put all the black people together in one place. Then the second one was that the government subsidized the development of suburbs on the condition that the builders would only sell to white people, and that when they resold, right, they could only sell to blacks. So that's the restrictive covenants. So let me give you an example that you can go look up, right? Levittown. Let's talk about Levittown. Levittown is, they've had it in Pennsylvania, in New York. A lot of times when we think of racial discrimination, we think that this is only, we always think about the South. Well, of course, we living in Chicago know that it's right here too. But it was all across the country. So Levittown was developed by the Levitt family, right? And in the 40s and 50s, there was a shortage of housing, and they wanted to build 17,000 houses. So what did the government do? The FHA offered to guarantee their bank loans for construction and development of Levittown on condition that no home be sold to African Americans. And every home had a clause in the deed prohibiting that resale. So we've seen the restrictive covenants here, but these restrictive covenants were actually all over the country. You want to get an FHA loan, you can't sell to African Americans, and you cannot resell to them either. So imagine at this time, we're having a boom. Homes are selling for $8,000 at a time, and now that home is worth, in today's dollars, that's $100,000, right? That was affordable to the working class African Americans, right? And today those homes are worth $300,000 to $400,000, right? So you bought a house for $8,000, which is about $100,000 in today's dollars, sold it at $300,000 to $400,000. You have now had $200,000 to $300,000 equity, right? In the insurance business, they'll tell you that today, the baby boomers are going through what we call the greatest transfer of wealth. Well, guess where that transfer of wealth came from? From this government subsidy, right? Restricting blacks from buying homes. These homes then became, they invested, they became the appreciation, right? They appreciated. If you have equity in your house, you can pull out money and start a business. Equity in your house, you can pull out money and send your children to school. All of the things that the black community was not able to do because they weren't given this opportunity. So today we find that black medium net worth is $4,900, and white wealth net worth is $97,000, right? 4,900, so that's like 5%, and they are 97,000, 97%, right? So this difference is based on policy. And so now it's not just the wicked realtors and all those other people. This is definitely an impact that the government created this problem. This is social engineering. And what is interesting is that he mentions when NPR did this interview with him, that the new Secretary of HUD, who has no experience, Mr. Carson, in housing, is quick to say that he's against social engineer programs. But in reality, in order to fix the problem that we have, we're going to have to do some more social engineering, because it was social engineering that caused the problem in the first place. Remember I said integrated communities were destroyed to put up segregated communities. The government is the one that was responsible for the segregation that we now see. So he goes on to talk about that during that time, coming out after World War II, over in California, Stanford University, there was a shortage of civilian housing, and this author, Wallace Stegner, he and 400 other families came together and bought this huge tract of land, right? And wanted to build housing. So they went to the government to try to get some funding, and the government refused to give them the capital for construction. Why? Because they had 3 African American members of the co-op, right? So they pushed back and they said, okay, well, we will limit the membership in the co-op and the houses to the percentage of African Americans in the state of California, right? So it will be proportionate. The government was like, no, not even 1. So when they couldn't do anything with their land, they ended up selling the land to a developer who then complied with the government and created a housing division that excluded blacks, right? So you see that in that time you had people who were of progressive minds, you know, who wanted to live the American dream and have that dream available to all people. But the government was very rigid and caused this. So then we have the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And that Fair Housing Act, it says, provided modest enforcement to prevent future discrimination. And I used to work for fair housing myself, so I know that this is true. It did nothing to reverse or undo a century's worth of state-sanctioned violations. So what you've seen is that we have Band-Aids now on stores that the government, who was supposed to be protecting our rights, ended up creating, okay? So I'm gonna, what is important for you to understand is that the game that we're playing right now has been a rigged game. And I give you this in context so you understand where we're at. We're not going to focus on that now. Now we're going to focus on how do we move forward and how do we find solutions to this, right? What is our economic reality? How do we change it? So now I'm going to ask my co-host, Bill, to jump in and kind of, you know, move us forward on this.
Well, one thing I would like to make a comment on before we go forward is that issue of lack of access. We now have a problem, an economic problem. We have all of the complications that go along with not being able to have fair housing. We live in restricted areas. We live in areas that often are environmentally unsafe. Mm-hmm. We find that blacks live in more polluted and toxic areas. I think 40% of the population lives in these toxic environments. The blacks live in 40% of the toxic areas across the U.S. That's pretty bad. Now, so we talk about lack of access. So what do we do? Mm-hmm. Do we wait for the government who created the problem to come and bail us out? Or do we try option 2, which is that we do those things ourselves that allow us to control our own destiny? I'm for option 2.
Yeah, me too.
So what has been done and what is being done to help us move from where we are now to where we need to be? Mm-hmm. Well, I know that, Cecile, you've been involved in work with the National Black Agenda. In fact, you're one of the co-authors of the National Black Agenda. And the Black Agenda is one of those visioning tools that help us move from where we are now to where we need to be. The National Black Agenda is something that everyone should read, mm-hmm. Because it addresses 13 areas that are common problems for black communities. In addition to that, in addition to identifying 13 areas like economics and education and public safety and media and many others, veterans, gender bias, it also provides over 250 ideas on things that communities can do mm-hmm. to help transform their condition. The other thing to keep in mind that indeed it is a tool that communities can use for planning. It is a tool that is a starting point for transformation. Once communities connect the dots, mm-hmm. And let me make one other point, which falls a little bit into your bailiwick. All communities are not equal. Each community has its unique set of problems, where education may be a major issue for you, or public safety or crime may be a major issue for you if you live in Chicago, every community does not have the same level or degree of problems that we may have in a community like Chicago. So what do we have to do? Well, what we have to do is to use the Black agenda as a visioning tool, point us in the right direction, and then we have to connect the dots. What do we mean by connect the dots? Mm-hmm. Well, that's what you do. It's the research and the development piece. Mm-hmm. And when we connect those dots, what does that mean? It does not simply mean that we go and identify a problem. We identify the root cause of the problem, and we look back at things like policy, those restrictive policies that created the problem in the first place. Unless we go to the root cause of the problem, and unless we connect those dots, we will never solve the problem. It is only then that we can begin to take our destinies and put it into our own hands.
Right.
Once we've identified those problems, there's a second piece that we've developed, which is called a rapid transformation process. Why do we create a rapid transformation process? Well, we'll talk a little later about the economic gap, the wealth gap between blacks and whites and other groups. Mm-hmm. And there are also gaps in many other areas, like education. Mm-hmm. There were two reports that I read recently that said if we continue at the same rate that we're going now, it would take us over 200 years to catch up with whites in terms of education and wealth. Mm-hmm. I don't know about you, but I don't have 200 years
I don't either.
to catch up. So what does that mean? That means that we have to do what we call rapid transformation. We have to move faster. And that just happens to be one of the areas that I did quite a bit of work when I worked with a number of organizations, mostly Fortune 500 companies. But that experience was very good from the standpoint that many of those institutions were very complex, very much like our problems. Mm-hmm. They're very complex. They span education, they span economics, it spans health and wellness, it spans public safety. These are not necessarily simple problems. But when you have some tools, some best practices that can be applied to those, it makes solving those a heck of a lot easier, and they go much faster. I'll give you an example about what can be done with rapid transformation. I was involved in a project with a large public institution here in Chicago. And what we were able to do is to implement a major project that normally took 2 years, and we were able to reduce it to less than a year and cut the cost in half at the same time. Best practices are all over the place. IBM, which is one of the companies that I used to work for, was able to cut their IT budget, which was a $2 billion budget, in half. Mm-hmm. So how does a Fortune 500 company that is sophisticated and has one of the largest market caps in the world do that? They do that through best practices. And those are the kind of tools that we need to bring and must bring to the black community in order to transform.
All right. You're hitting the nail right on the head, because we have a number of I guess some of our brighter minds in our community, and the first thing they do is head off to the Fortune 500, right? When in reality, we need some of them to come back to community and bring that brain power, right? So over the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about how do we fix these fixable problems. They are fixable, right? We're going to talk about the crisis in leadership. We're going to talk about how some of the understandings of the problems and the solutions are not clear. They're always very vague. When it comes to us, nobody wants to be holistic in the way they resolve our issues, right? And we have to be, because other communities, that's how they deal with them. We have a drug crisis now happening in the white community. And look, every day it's something the Congress is talking about, and they want to do something. But when we had a drug crisis that the government helped to create in our community, all we could find was a solution was to lock the people up, right? So we will be talking about solutions, we'll be talking about strategies, and we want people to become more versed in connecting those dots. So I'm going to look forward to, being with you and talking and sharing those ideas and showing community. A lot of times I'm out with young people and I say to them, I always ask them, what is it you plan to do? And when they tell me what they plan to do, I always say to them, but you're bringing it back to community, right? Right? Because if I spend all this money to educate you, and then you don't come back to our community to give us the best that you have to offer, then it's as if I wasted my money, right? Because if it's not benefiting us, I'm wasting my money. And we say this, folks, and we really want people to understand that. The black community has issues, but these issues can be resolved if the black community focuses on the black community, just like every other community focuses on itself. And that's not being racist or anything else or discriminatory. It's about self-preservation. I told you at the beginning I'm a human rights defender. And right now we're on the mission of self-determination. What does that mean? It means that we need to run our own communities. We need to control our schools. We need to own the banks in our area. Everything that has to do with us, we need to own the businesses so the dollar doesn't spend 6 hours in our community and 30 days in Chinatown. Why? Because the Asian community understands that having businesses that they own means that they can employ their own people, right? And so therefore they won't have to be out getting social services or anything else because they have the money. The Jewish community the dollar spends 20 days there. And in the overall white community, the dollar spends 17 days. So 6 hours in the black community and all that other time with everybody else. So we have to focus on what are going to be the solutions to bring that money home, create the jobs. These are fixable solutions, right? This is fixable. In the 60s and 70s, we had all these corridors that were black businesses. So we kind of like integrated into nothingness. That's how a lot of people look at it now. And what did we learn from the last 50 years? We learned that you can't expect the government, who created some of your problems, to solve your problems, right? Hence the problem we're in right now. And that if we're going to solve this problem, we will have to solve the problem, us, members of our community, because we're quite capable. We need to be empowered. So part of what we'll be doing is empowering you to realize that, yes, we have the capacity. We need children trained in different things as they grow up, right? So we'll be talking about education in the future, et cetera. And we need leadership. And leadership starts with I, because if I need to know how to run my house, then I can be a member in my community that's productive. So we talk about community leadership development. And then we can talk about political leadership development, because I'm telling you, some of these people who are representing us, waste of time, right? So we're going to talk about that too. So as you can see, Bill Patterson is going to be part of all of this, and we look forward to what we'll be able to do. Again, my name is Cecile Johnson, and I'm CEO of African Development Plan. This is my co-host, Bill Patterson, and we want to thank Global City Unity's Community Outreach for giving us this opportunity to speak on the global black community, on issues affecting our community, and the solutions that we can do. Thank you. Hi there, this is Cecile Johnson, and I'm here with my co-host Bill Patterson, and we're here as part of Global City Unity's Community Outreach, which is to keep you informed about issues affecting the global black community, and these issues require us to unify and be on one accord to find solutions. So this is about solutions. A little bit about myself again. I am the CEO and founder of African Development Plan, which is a nonprofit located here in Chicago. And what I've been doing is research and educating the public about issues that are impacting the black community. And I have been doing what we call a series on connecting the dots, right? I use historical data, I use current, and I kind of sew the pieces together like I'm making a quilt. So we address problems, but we focus on long-term sustainable solutions. I usually tell the young people, you get to complain once, and if you don't come up with a solution the next time, then you need to not talk, right? So I'm also a board member of the National Black Agenda Consortium and co-author of the 2017 Black Agenda, which you need to read, and I'm a human rights defender. So I say this all because when we are talking about the issues and the solutions, I'm looking at it with a holistic approach, and that holistic approach allows us to come up with better solutions. My co-host is William Patterson, and he is a co-founder of JPPC LLC, which is a planning and sustainable development consortium, and they've been launching a series of training and support initiatives to transform American communities. This series includes issues of leadership development and creation of transformation strategies. It also focuses on rapid deployment. You know, a lot of times they say we're going to take 200 years to catch up. Listen, folks, we ain't got the time. And for other communities, they don't take 200 years. So when it comes to black people, we ain't taking 200 years either, okay? We discuss how to create the vision, strategies, and infrastructure. And Bill has spent over 40 years he's spent over 3 decades, over 30 years working with over 40 Fortune 500 companies and major public sector institutions, developing strategies and help, transforming by reducing waste and improving profitability and performance, right? We have a lot of brilliant people in our community, but guess what? They're working for Fortune 500s and others, right? And they're helping them to become profitable. We're looking at someone like Bill and others who are coming back into community. Well, they never really left, right? Who are focused on taking those same strategies that the big boys do and bring it to us. So, welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Cecile.
Thank you for sharing this time with me and sharing your expertise. This show, number 2, is called Community Transformation Through the Black Agenda. It's part of a series of talks that we're hosting that focuses on the challenges facing the black community, and especially in terms of community and stakeholder engagement. Our community is very apathetic, right? We're not going to solve the problems of the community with 1 or 2 experts. We're going to solve the problems of the community when the community decides that it has a problem and wants to find a solution. So, these talks that we're going to be having, I consider myself a farmer, but I farm with ideas. I want to put some seeds in your head and let's water them and help them to grow. You're going to help me help you. We want to look at how these challenges keep us from achieving our maximum potential and what are some new opportunities, right? So, 2 complementary elements needed for successful community transformation. You need to ensure equal access through elimination of disparities, right? That means you have to identify the root causes. And you have to create your own solutions to affect positive change. Other people's solutions won't work for us. We have unique situations where we have to come up with issues and solutions that meet the needs of what we know is happening in our community. We also say to create the power within the black community, you need to transform and create sustainable results. And there's a gentleman, Dr. Claude Anderson, that I like to quote, right? When I heard about him in one of my classes years ago in school. He said that there are 5 steps to acquiring power in the community. Now I want you to note this. Take your paper, write. Economics, political, legal, media, number 4, 5th is education, right? So, economics, political, legal, media, education. This is very important. Economics, right? We're in a capitalist system. He who controls the money controls the power, right? If I got money, then I can buy, sell, rent, and lease my politicians. Isn't that what's going on? Isn't that what the Supreme Court said we can do, right? So that's what you see happening. Those who have the money control the people who make the laws. That's your political class. And if you look today at all this stuff that's going on with the healthcare, and you look who funds many of our Congress and Senate, you'll see pharmacy, you'll see drug companies in the background, right? Hence the reason we haven't been able to get much reform on a lot of those things, right? So who is paying your representative, right? It's in this game, you either have the money or you have the numbers, right? That's what a great organizer said in the past, Saul Alinsky. You have money or you have numbers, right? And when you look at the political, right, how do you get the vote out in your community? Once these people get elected, how do we hold them accountable? The third stage is legal, right? Legislators make the laws and policies which impact your day-to-day life. You've never been a community so impacted by laws like us, right? On every level. And why is that? Because 4% or so of the lawyers are black. About 80-something% are white. So that means if you're not a lawyer, it's very hard for you to become a prosecutor. It's very hard for you to become a judge, right? So from law to judge. And so we're not represented in the legal system, but we are overrepresented in the people who are impacted by the legal system, right? Then the fourth stage is the media. Who shapes how we think about ourselves, right? Advertisements shape the stereotypes. So today, most people look at the black community. I have a friend call me from Europe and asked me if I've been to Cabrini Green. I'm sorry, I said no, I haven't, right? Because he assumes I'm in Chicago. And then he said, yeah, and your community has serious problems with guns and drugs. I say, I don't have any guns or any drugs, right? So it's a stereotype. It's a stereotype on how you feel that I should be and the things that you think that I should know about. And I don't always know about those things. And there's so many other things about our community that I know you've seen on CAN TV, right? About our culture. We're trendsetters in many different ways. It's just that it has not been a full picture. So who shapes that message? We're hoping to shape that message by being here. The fifth stage is education. How well are your children performing in schools? Now, I have done a series of shows that talk about the data on what's going on, right? What are they learning? Are they meeting the needs of the black community? 11% of CPS graduates are college ready. And of that 11%, the majority are white and Asian, right? So if maybe 2 or 3% of that 11% are black, that would be a lot. How do we build a community with so few children being educated? 17% of children, black children in 8th grade nationwide, are reading at 8th grade level. So you want to know why they're not doing very well in high school? Because they can't read and write. They're at 3rd, 4th, 5th grade level, and then you expect them to do 9th grade work. So there's a disconnect. So economics, political, legal, media, education. These are the 5 steps to power. And if you have a philosophy about your community, the first one should be to make sure that your families are whole, right? And how do you do that? Policy has a lot to do with that. The next thing is to make sure that your children get the best education that they have, and that education is geared towards meeting the needs of your community, not what some fad says. Because in reality, the black community is like an underdeveloped nation within a developed nation. We are a colonized people at this moment. So my needs and the white society needs are not the same needs, right? My needs is about my liberation and about my putting in basic infrastructure that transfers wealth to my people so we can run our own things. So that's what Claude Anderson talks about, the 5 steps to acquiring power. And you'll see later on how that ties in. There's another important concept that you need to understand, and it's called center and periphery. And this was something I learned at the Center for Inner City Studies. They talked about this gentleman, Edward Shills, and he asked the question, who has the power and the influence? And he said the center, which is sacred. So who's in the center? It's the subsystems, it's the economy. I just told you about power, right? It's the status, right? It's the politics, it's the kinship and the value, who you're related to, right? It's the institutions which have in their custody the cultivation of cultural values. That's the educational system, right? And this includes your educations, your universities, and your ecclesiastic, or your churches and your religious institutions. They define our belief systems. So the producers of these subsystems are what they call the immortal intellectuals. These are people we are told to study. You notice every time they quote some expert, there's always somebody who don't look like me and you, right? As if we don't have any great thoughts and ideas. That's how you lock people out of the system. You create these institutions, they become the things that stamp the seal of approval on you, and then you lock us out, right? So where you fit in today is decided by how close you are to the center, and in the world today, that distance from the center is usually defined by race. Go anywhere in the world and you see this. Everywhere you go, even in some of the black countries, the darker your skin usually is the further you are away from power, right? That's a sad reality. So today we're going to be talking about when we look at how we're going to do some transformation, we talk about disproportionate representation. Black people make up 13.3% of the population, yet we have 3 senators, right? If we were proportionately represented, we would have 13 senators. We got 3. Latinos make up 17.6%. They have 4 senators. If they were proportionately represented, they would have 17 senators, right? The Asians have 3 senators, and they're 5.6% of the population, same thing. The Jews are 2.1% of the population, and they have 8 senators, right? So when people say to you that if you are a minority and you're small, you can't have power, I say to you, go look at our Congress, because that's not what we see, right? They have 8 senators, right? So that means that it's 4 times their percentage. And when it comes to congressmen, they have double their representation. So why is this, right? Why do we allow this to happen? As we become more aware of the numbers and how that then impacts why resources don't come back to our community. Because they don't come back to our community because the second step in power is political. Well, if you don't have politicians representing your interests, how are you going to get the power back to your community? So I just wanted to lay a groundwork. And so that is the 5 steps to power, and that is center and periphery. And I hope that you understand that, because now I'm going to ask Bill to jump in and begin to take us along this little path.
Well, thank you, Cecile. One of the things I'd like to just briefly comment on is this issue of education, because that's dear to my heart. What we have in this country is what I like to call a crisis of leadership. And that crisis of leadership, well, first of all, let's talk about leaders. Who are leaders? Well, certainly it's the people who run institutions. They may be politicians. They may be community leaders. But the bottom line is we have to also be leaders. Leadership goes all the way down to the family and the individual. Mm-hmm. If we aren't exerting leadership, and if we aren't learning those skills that we need not only to transform our own destiny, but to transform the destiny of our communities, we're missing the boat. And one of the problems that we have is that we have not been able to connect the dot. We have not been able to connect our own personal accountability.
That's right.
With the issues and problems that we now face. Where there are huge problems, there are also huge opportunities. That is something that we often fail to see. For example, we spend over $100,000 putting a child through high school. Mm-hmm. Between his, when he starts in elementary school all the way to high school, we spend $1,000. Yet, a substantial portion of those kids come out unprepared for life, mm-hmm. and unprepared for college. Now, that is an opportunity. It's a problem, but it's also an opportunity. Multiply the number of kids who graduate every year by the number of dollars that are wasted, and I think you get a feel for what could be done if we actually took our destinies into our own hands and became a part of the education process. Teachers, our own schools, mm-hmm. Our own administrators, changing our communities. We have to step up. We have to connect the dots. We have to understand that everything is not a problem. Any problem, for the most part, can be transformed into an opportunity. Anytime there's one problem, you can be sure there's also enormous waste. I would say that if less than 20% are coming out of school college ready or ready for life, we have a serious problem. We have misspent dollars. Mm-hmm. Why don't we take advantage of our own resources? Why don't we correct those problems ourselves, because our elected officials and some of our institutions are failing at the job.
Right.
And we have to when we have a problem, we have to acknowledge that we have a problem. That's the first step to solving it. Now, in regard to Dr. Anderson's model on stages of power, mm-hmm. Though that's a very important model that should be integrated into any planning when it comes to community transformation. because we can't get a lot done unless we have some sense of power. It is a visioning tool, very much like the National Black Agenda is a visioning tool. It points us in a direction. It helps us to connect the dots. Mm-hmm. And where necessary, obviously, you bring people on board who also can facilitate that process. As we mentioned in our last session, many of our problems are complex. For example, let's take a look at the National Black Agenda. There are 13 focus areas that were identified: media, economic empowerment, education, faith-based organizations, health and wellness, big topic. Mm-hmm. Housing, which we talked about, international policy, political empowerment, public safety, reparations, veterans restoration, and women, acknowledging and leveraging the power of women, looking at disparities that currently take place. All of these are issues that are identified in the Black Agenda, and that's a great starting point for developing strategies for transformation for our communities. Along with that is, of course, along with that is, of course, training on leadership development and developing an infrastructure that needs to be in place in order for us to transform. Now, one of the things that we believe is an essential part of a transformation process is, first of all, having a community agenda. The National Black Agenda is a great starting point, a tool to help us plan. The next step in that process is to do an assessment of the community. Mm-hmm. Each community's problems, a community's problem may be different from another community's problem. So we must make sure that we tailor a strategy that's suitable to solving your particular problems. So that's where connecting the dots comes in. That's where the kind of research, obviously, that you do comes into play. And it also means not only just identifying what problems exist, but what policies and procedures must be implemented as you go along. Now, I'm a rapid deployment strategy guy, so I don't like to just collect numbers.
Right.
What I like to do is to put things in place as you go along, so that as you collect the numbers, you also build the infrastructure. Those are the kind of things that I think our communities need to do, is to build infrastructures and solutions and design policies as they go along, not just collect numbers, saying the same thing we've heard for a million years, that blacks are underperforming, that there's a wealth gap, there's an education gap. We all know that.
Right.
The question is, what do we do about it? And that's where the policy development and the leadership development comes in. As we mentioned before, there is a crisis of leadership. And that crisis of leadership starts at the top and it goes all the way down to the individual. We're all individuals and we must take responsibility for change. But there's another important piece. And that other important piece is one of stakeholder engagement. Right. Well, who are these stakeholders? Right. Well, as we look at the Black Agenda and we look at each individual problem, we find out that maybe our stakeholders may be the faith-based institutions. Stakeholders are obviously the individuals within the community, the businesses, the human service and public service agencies, police force. All of these are stakeholders in the process, and we must find better ways to engage them. Mm-hmm. And there are better ways to engage them. Many times we try to solve problems that have been solved a million times over. Sometimes we simply have to look back, find those things that are actually working, and put those in place. We call those best practices. And when you look at what Fortune 500 companies do, when you look at what some major public sector organizations do, those that excel, those that are efficient, effective, and productive use best practices, and they put control systems in place that allow them to get the job done.
Right. Well, I agree totally with you, Bill. When we created the Black Agenda, it's really coming off of a 1972 document that has been updated through the years. And what we found was that we needed to have a different approach to it, right? So this time it has, we wanted people to be able to have an action that they could do. So we broke it into policy, we broke it into what I as an individual can do, what a community can do, and then we talked about what politicians and community leaders could do, right? That way you felt that you were a part of the agenda. And we really would encourage you to look at it at National Black Agenda Consortium.org. Look for the Agenda 2017 and read it. Would encourage you to take it and turn it into a 13-week study, right? It's about 66 pages, so it's not a lot. But what you would do is take those sections, discuss it with your members, and then see whose area of specialty that would be, and in what way do you need to implement it, right? And by that way, you would then begin to connect with the issues that are impacting around your community as it relates to those different areas of the agenda. So we really would encourage that. We've been meeting a lot with the groups in community and talking about the Trump's agenda for Black America, right? And what that looks like. Some of you don't know that he has an agenda for Black America. He does, right? We like to look at opportunity. So in that agenda, we look at economics, we look at health, we look at education, we look at public safety and justice. The other day, people were getting very upset with the new Secretary of Education. I really don't care. Why would I say that? But if only 17% of our children are performing, the education system as it now stands has been a failure for us, right? So we're open to new ideas. We're not going to spend 4 more years and get nothing, right? We're going to get something out of this, including that we are going to be the ones to generate. And I'm talking about we as a community, right? Anybody coming to rescue you, you're going to rescue yourself. So we're looking at, under those education, economics, public safety, right? How do we build capacity? And in building capacity, how do we tie in the resources that we already have? Folks, we have in Chicago, Dunbar Vocational Tech used to hold 2,000 students, now it has 500. Could you tell me why? And we still need people to build everything that's out there, right? Renovate and build brand new. So why are we not having our children get this kind of education, right? I went down to another Chicago Vocational Tech, same thing, a big, beautiful building and a small amount of people in there. Why? And our community has high unemployment and children who, when you ask them what they're going to do with themselves, have no clue, no idea. So we need you to get involved. We need you to look at the Black Agenda. We need you to remember the framework that we've talked about, which is having a visioning tool, which is what the agenda is. Taking that, doing a needs assessment on your community, your church, your group, your organization, right? Knowing where you stand, where your community stands, looking at the policy that has impacted you, looking at the leadership that needs to be developed. We are suffering from a crisis of leadership, or lack thereof, on every level, from your home right up to the politicians, right? And then how do we engage and sustain our community through stakeholder engagement? So, once again, my name is Cecile Johnson, and my co-host is William Patterson, and we want to thank Global City Unity's Community Outreach for giving us this opportunity to be able to talk to you about some of the issues that are impacting the global Black community and giving us an opportunity to begin to sow the seeds for what we think will be some solutions. We encourage you to reach out to me, African Development Plan at gmail.com. And let me know if you have any questions, and you know, we can come out and talk to your groups, but you can reach us that way. And we look forward to getting involved. Like I said, I'm a farmer. I'm farming ideas. I'm planting some seeds, and I know you are fertile ground, and I know that together we can all do this. So, thank you.
is Charlene Yomo, and I'm pleased to be here on behalf of Global City Unity. And the purpose of this session is getting Chicago united. And if you pay attention to the propaganda that's being put out in the atmosphere every day, all day long, we are divided, people are hating each other. But you know, I spent some time driving for Uber, and I have discovered in driving for Uber that this city is much more united than we even know. Uber has something called pooling, where people just get together, they don't know each other, and they share a ride. Sometimes that's blacks with whites, with Orientals, with Russians, with people from Poland, and they have wonderful conversations with each other. So we are being victimized by propaganda, the propaganda that desires to keep people separated from one another. And I want to spend some time talking about this because as a people, we people of color in the United States, we are really victimized by propaganda. You hear about the gap all the time between the high-achieving European people and the low-achieving black people. Well, knowledge came from Africa. The only universities that there were in the world at one time were in Timbuktu. That's where and just outside of Egypt, that's where the Greeks went to study. And when the subject is brought up about low-achieving people, the pyramids, the Sphinx, all that stuff required a knowledge of geometry, algebra, astronomy, astrology. All that stuff was completed between 5 and 7,000 BC. This is 2016 for the era of people that we're living with now, the people who have the power. The people out of the Teutonic, meaning Germanic, and they took power from the Romans. The Romans took power from the Greeks, and the Greeks were the first exterior force to overrun Egypt. Egypt, while it was still black, was a very welcoming place, and that's how it ended up changing colors. They were not racist people, so as people moved near them that were of a different color, they absorbed them, they assimilated them, and they turned from black to brown to the diverse colors that you see there today. I say this because ever since Obama was elected president, and that was a cultural phenomenon. The cultural trait of African people is said to be xenophiliac, which means lover of xeno people. Xenophobia is suspicion and sometimes hatred of people who are different from one, and that was a characteristic of European culture. So that when Obama was elected president by many more white people than black people, that was a cultural phenomena. And now we're dealing with a backlash from that. I think things are going to get worse, not just because of Donald Trump, but because of what he represents. Because that put the fear in those people that they are actually losing power. And they are. That's God's decision. We're powerless over that. I think God has gotten a little tired of the injustices that people are suffering, and the same mistakes that have been made by powers that preceded this one are being made over and over again. It seems as though nobody ever learns. However, I think one of the things that we as African Americans need to concentrate on now is to reconnect with our African roots. That doesn't mean that everything we learn about who we were before we came here, we have to go back and do everything the same. No, we are not going to do that because we contributed to our situation as it stands. So we're going to pick and choose that which is good. We're going to resuscitate or bring back to life, and that which is not, we're going to leave it alone. It's so important. I want to talk about, if we're going to talk about an African country, let's talk about the Congo for a moment. The Congo is maybe 2 or 3 times the size of the United States. And the original Congo kingdom was even greater than that. It was Angola, Congo-Kinshasa, Congo-Brazzaville, and part of Zambia. And I believe that Congo was part of the original Ethiopia. The Congo was only colonized for 85 years. West Africa, 400 years. East Africa, 2,000 years. And after 85 years, those Congo people created somebody just like Malcolm, and they kicked the colonial powers out. Now, that's not to say that everyone is free from this colonial system. We are still suffering from this. But there are a lot of people in the world, regardless of their color, who want to be one with other people. They do not want to be against people who are different. They want to be one. We've got to work with the positive forces, and we've got to start at home with our youth. These young people who are out here killing each other. Why are they doing that? They're doing that because they don't see any value in black life. And they're victims of propaganda. We're being told that we're living on the bottom. We didn't contribute anything. This country would be on its knees if it hadn't been for all the things that people out of Africa contributed to this country. It's just now coming out about the woman who helped the space program by assuring them that they could fly, okay? And now, just the last couple of days, Oprah's doing this new movie about this woman who they took her cells and harvested them and have created all these medicines from her, let alone all the inventions that were done and created during the slave era and after that we were never allowed to claim, get paid for. We've got to free ourselves from this mentality. We've got to stop for a moment and figure out how do free people do things as opposed to how slaves do things, because a lot of what is bothering us and is keeping us back today are characteristics that we picked up during slavery. Another thing that I want to just bring up just at the moment, we need God in our lives. God is. Now, maybe you don't believe in God. Maybe you never felt God's presence. Well, I have. So you can think what you want to think, but I know God is. And one thing that's happening that as much as we need God, there are a lot of people who are proclaiming that they have been called to preach. You know when someone's been called to preach because you can feel the presence of God around them. To some people, this is just a way for them to make some money. And people, these false prophets, are chasing a lot of people away from God. That is the result of being a false prophet. So we've got to do some work. Fortunately, I was here watching an earlier segment when a preacher was actually talking about ministers who've been called, and I just happened to make that statement, and he was very pleased about that. We need God, and we've got to determine how do we know when we are in the presence of godly people. We've got to begin to reach out to each other.